Okay, we'll call the meeting to order. So we're on to item 2, verification of a meeting quorum.
Jeff, I'll just announce I'm attending under AB 2449. I'm homesick. Our regular location is ready to bring in the public if anybody shows up, and there's no one under the age of 18 with me, or over the age of 18 with me.
Great. And Amy, are you verifying the quorum?
Yes, it appears we have a quorum. Justin, can you verify?
Yes.
Great. So we are on to item 3, matters subsequent to posting the agenda. Are there any matters anyone wants to bring up? Okay, I'm not hearing any. So we're on to public comment. Any member of the public that wants to address the board on a matter not on the agenda. I see 4 attendees. If you want to raise your hand, you can do that now. Okay, I'm not hearing any, so we'll move on to item 5, which is the consent agenda. Any discussion on that, which are the minutes of the board meeting on March 19th? Or does any board member want to make a motion?
I move approval.
Great. Is there a second?
I'll second. Oh, sorry, Sean.
No worries. I'm also letting you know I'm on the line. Either way.
Great. Welcome, Sean. Thank you. Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Any other discussion on the consent agenda before we vote? Okay, then we'll move on to voting.
Public comment?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I will go over to public comment. Any member of the public wanting to comment on the consent agenda? And I'm not hearing any, so now we will go to voting. Amy, do you want to bring up the vote? Or Justin, are you doing that?
I think I'm doing it. So apologies, it's my first meeting. So Amy, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So I'll call off each of the members. So Ava Community Energy.
Yes.
Central Coast Community Energy.
Yes.
Clean Power SF.
Yes, apologies for no camera. I'm having technical difficulty.
Peninsula Clean Energy.
Yes.
Redwood Coast Energy Authority.
Yes.
San Jose Clean Energy.
Yes.
Silicon Valley Clean Energy.
Yes.
Sonoma Clean Power Authority.
Yes.
Valley Clean Energy.
Abstain.
Okay, great. So we are on to item 6A, which is approval of the coordinated operations agreement for Tumbleweed. I'll pass it over to you, Alex, to go through that.
Okay, welcome board members and thank you. What we'll discuss now is agenda item 6A, the amendment to Tumbleweed PPSA to add a coordinated operations agreement, which will be an additional exhibit underneath the entire contract of the Tumbleweed PPSA. So when Tumbleweed was amended in 2022, there was steps were taken to require a coordinated operations agreement. And with today's vote, we now have the coordinated operations agreement being presented. We're supportive and confident that this is the right approach, and we have incorporated feedback from the board at a discussion item last month. So the nature of the COA is that it aligns with the PPSA in delegating authority to CC Power. Within that construct, though, we have created several pathways for feedback from participating members, including our ability to get non-binding vote information or advisory vote information so that we make sure CC Power is working very collaboratively with members on any operating decisions for the Tumbleweed project. These operating decisions include identifying and selecting a scheduling coordinator, scheduling outages, overseeing bidding strategies and behaviors and settlements, and other operating matters. I would say in most times these matters can be routine. That said, we know that issues will come up, and we think the COA structure that's before you can accommodate those situations while balancing the need for input from members, participating members, with the need for timely decisions on operational issues. One important issue also is that we think this is an important milestone for CC Power. We're looking to really operationalize our first power project, and we think there will be a lot of learning. So, supported by many who've been shaping this COA, there's an interest to crack it open for review and to report back to the board within 21 months of operations so that we have a chance to course correct if needed. And I think this is the type of flexible approach that will allow us to move forward while recognizing the board still can shape and redirect if we see any issues or have concerns with how things are going. This somewhat complicated picture highlights how the board is still really in control, and how there's these dashed feedback loops to the decision-making entity inside CC Power, which is underneath me, and we're calling that the lead point person. And that also how there's a lot of back and forth with what we're calling the Operations Advisory Subcommittee. So that's not a Brown Act committee, it's just a subcommittee, but that's the place where your staff who participate in this project would be able to plug in and really get all the information and communicate directly with our staff. And then ultimately, the general manager reports up to the board. And we also will encourage, of course, any Operations Advisory Subcommittee members to report up and out to you all through your CCAs where appropriate. And that way, the board should be sufficiently informed and will be, I think, getting all the right pieces of feedback to make smart decisions here. So with that, Chair Mitchell, I turn it back over to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, Alex. Any questions by members of the board?
I have one. And Rob,
Great. Yep, Sean, go ahead.
thank you, Director Morse. I appreciate the report, and I just wanted to clarify. I believe that this is correct in the draft document or the COA itself, but that the lead point person, who essentially will be the lead from CC Power, will act commensurate with the direction of the board, but could then still act in conflict with the operations subcommittee vote, or did that get cleared up?
Under limited circumstances, they could operate being misaligned with the Operations Advisory Subcommittee. The Operations Advisory Subcommittee ultimately is an advisory body, but we've structured some processes whereby the feedback from the Operations Advisory Subcommittee would be pretty clear through perhaps these informal votes. And so we also, recognizing that risk of misalignment, would require the CC Power side to report up to the board if we ever take action that's misaligned. And that was our way of trying to balance the speed and operating needs with the fact that for the PPSA, really, we're only setting up a subcommittee, not a full committee.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Monica.
Yeah, I just want to just clarify. And so the function of the subcommittee and the authority that the CC Power staff has around operating these resources is very somewhat operational in nature, right? It's setting a bid schedule, setting the outage schedule, things that have to happen day to day, and things that we probably don't ever want to discuss in a Brown Act public meeting, right? For various reasons, right? So that information is never going to come back to the board, I would hope. And so do we have the proper, have we given the general manager the proper authority that if there is a conflict, that you can resolve those conflicts yourself, because they shouldn't come to the board. For instance, I'll give you an example. If say there's a disagreement between when we should take an outage for maintenance, like we don't want to bring that to the board. That shouldn't come to the board. So if there's a disagreement between the members, you guys have the ability to resolve that, right?
Yeah, we do. And basically, the decision authority rests within CC Power. It's been delegated, and then so CC Power would hold that. But what we've tried hard to do is make sure that and that's required by the contract, Director Padilla, but then we would not be reporting to the board on the specific issue, but we would report to the board if there's a conflict. So we would just tell the board that our model had a conflict where there was disagreement between ultimately the decision of CC Power and the input collectively from the members. And I think that would help the board decide if the POA that we're authorizing here is appropriate or if we want to tune it. And then that would be the board's right to do.
Yeah, that's a good clarification. Any other questions? Rob?
Thank you, Chair Mitchell. Alex, can you talk a little bit about different models that you looked at when contemplating the COA approach?
Certainly, as a little bit of background, for over a year we've worked on this, and I think there's a lot of interest from us and from your staff to make sure that we're operating Tumbleweed perfectly and as wisely as we can. So we've been working on what the right level of feedback and engagement from staff is and how we reflect the different shares and input opinions from parties. On one hand, we've looked at a really structured COA that really specifically lays out what decisions could be made by whom and when. And some of that started to run afoul, Director Shaw, of where the decision-making apparatus would require a Brown Act body. And in the interest of not doing that and having the board really remain the deciding Brown Act body, we landed on this roles and responsibilities model that continues to keep the decision-making authority delegated to CC Power, but make sure there's really good lines of communication open between staff and CC Power, and the sort of report up line that if there is a conflict, we would notify you of it. And on top of that, as you know, we thought it prudent to force in a review of the COA once we've been through operating over 12 months, and we kind of stretch that out to 21 months so that we have perhaps one or two different versions of the seasons, so that we have sufficient operating experience to then tell people if we have recommended changes. I also see, Director Shaw, that Philippe Gerritson's raised his hand and he may have more to offer.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that we did look at different forms of agreement as well. So a standalone COA, a master COA structure that could be applicable across all resources that we integrate into CC Power for operations, so that we have like a flexible but structured approach under which we would have confirms for any deviations from the standard terms and conditions. We decided, based upon feedback from the members, to first focus in on the Tumbleweed COA specifically and use that as a mechanism to gain learning and inform whether there might be any changes that we want to make going forward to the COA terms and conditions. But we still do want to try to explore this concept, likely now in the form of like a master PPSA that has the COA as a part of it, to create more of like a streamlined process for standardizing our operations and the reporting responsibilities and roles and responsibilities between CC Power and the participating members for any given project.
Chair Mitchell, if I can, I just have a couple of quick follow-ups. First, it sounds like, given that this is a storage project, that you're still open and evaluating sort of like what the right COA model would be for generation resources, especially depending on what those generation resources are. And I see head nodding, and I think that's appropriate. And I agree with Director Padilla, the approach of, there has to be some ability of CC Power to make sort of operational decisions in real time and resolve conflicts. There's going to be issues where members of the advisory body may not agree. They may not be able to get consensus. There will also, potentially be times when the board does need to give direction, which might be amending the COA agreement or advising sort of a different approach. And I have a little bit of concern about the full board having insight to the COA agreement or direction and control over the COA agreement when not all of us as board members are participating in the COA. So I'm having the discussion here because it's kind of precedent setting, but I would really encourage you to look at sort of other models, like even a UAMPS model where you have a smaller subset of the board that are the project participants that would serve as the managers of the COA. In those situations, it can be quick, where you're suspending a meeting and calling a new meeting to order where it's just those participants. And I think that's appropriate because we don't want to be sharing information that as a non-participant in the PSA that I should have. I'm not a party to this PSA or the energy storage agreement. And I think that's something that I really encourage you to continue working on, even though this one might be done for participants. I intend to abstain from the vote of approving the COA agreement. And then I would really encourage you to continue looking at models where only the participating members are overseeing the COA agreement. And then we as board members of CC Power could help give policy direction around what those models might look like, what standards of COA agreements and interactions, how we want to conduct ourselves as partners might look, but not operationally around projects and how we participate in them. Thank you. A little bit of a comment in addition to question, but thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. That's really well put. Okay, Monica, and then Howard.
Yeah, mine's more common as well. 100% agree with what Rob or Director Shaw has said here. Certainly, and I appreciate the acknowledgement that you'll abstain since you're not a participant in the project. I also want to make sure that we don't put ourselves, whether it's through something that comes to the board or something that's brought to the subcommittee, that creates somewhat of a conflict in terms of who can see like bidding strategies. I don't know if there are other members of this agency who are participants in Tumbleweed or any future contract that we might have. But if we're not scheduling under the same under the same scheduling coordinator or resource ID, then we can't share information. That's just prohibited, right? And so let's make sure that we don't set up a system where we inadvertently, violate that. And so this idea of if you're a participant, only participants should be privy to confidential information, including a bidding strategy, which I consider to be confidential.
Yeah, agreed. Let's go to Howard quickly, and then Philippe, I'll come back to you.
I'll just note I generally agree with a lot of the comments that Director Shaw made, and I'm glad you raised the fact that you'll abstain because I'm in a similar position where Ava is not a participant in this particular project. So I generally think that makes sense, but I was sort of questioning that approach myself of whether I should vote or abstain. And so maybe I'll just highlight my general question, which is how much I think there is value in non-participants seeing the COA itself because it sets a framework for how we want to generally operate projects. So there may be some value in that, and certainly opinions that we may have, even if we're not a direct participant. I absolutely agree. If there's actual operating data, confidential data, we should not be privy to that. So we should make sure that we're disciplined about that. But one question I have is sort of, do we view the risk of operating this project to be 100% borne by the project participants, or is CC Power in some way liable for some of that? So that would be the only area to consider. Is there a perspective that where we should be a greater participant and to vote on it and make sure that we have thoughts on the operating agreement itself, or is it truly and fully all of the participants themselves are absorbing all of that risk, and CC Power as an entity truly is not actually engaged? And so, well, I shouldn't say engaged, but taking any liability as a result of that. So that's a clarification I have.
Director Mitchell, may I respond?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So Howard, I think the intent, and we'll confirm this contractually, is that all of the risks associated with that project sit on the project participants themselves and not on CC Power. CC Power is obviously the pass-through entity there, but that's how we structured the contract. So we'll confirm that, and I take your point, and I take all the other points very as excellent points and things we should continue to monitor for. And one other thing we can research is that, and there's a little institutional memory here, is that, you know, some of these project amendments and project matters, we can take them just to the project participants as long as we have a quorum of the project participants. We hadn't set that up for today because, you know, we viewed this as a milestone moment, and we hadn't viewed the language as really critical, but we can look at how we report out to the board if there are issues in line with Director Shaw's point, and make sure that we don't share information inappropriately. I think Director Shaw's point also of keeping confidential information privy to the right parties is something we take very seriously, and we'll make sure we've structured into the operating protocols.
Yeah, if I can just add on to that, we had shared this concept of a master COA with the broader resource planning working group as a potential avenue to establish those standard terms and conditions for how we would delegate roles and responsibilities between CC Power and project participants. Ultimately, we envision that we will have a portfolio of multiple generation and storage assets that we are managing for CC Power members. And so we will want to establish standard protocols and operating procedures for how CC Power manages resources, but recognize that individual projects may have specific requirements as informed by those project participants, and that the individual performance of each resource and decisions made about how to operate that individual resource should be made solely by the project participants. So the vision that we have is that we can go to a structure at some point where we have, say, a master PPSA that has standard terms and conditions, including the operating roles and responsibilities as informed by the COA, and that there may be standard protocols for how CC Power operates that are informed by all members, but then the specifics on resource performance are going to be solely shared within the subset of those project participants for that resource. And so that's very analogous to how we have the project advisory subcommittees today, where we have a firm clean resources subcommittee and a long duration storage subcommittee. Within the long duration storage, we have a different set of members for Tumbleweed as opposed to Goal Line. And so we ask that the participants in Tumbleweed that are not in Goal Line recuse themselves from the remainder of the meeting when we switch from one resource to the next. And we do that holding it in one venue for efficiency purposes, but ultimately ensuring that only the project participants that are entitled to see that information are actually present when we switch from one resource to the next. And so we would look to kind of replicate that sort of concept when it comes to operations, but be very strict in terms of who may attend for which resources to ensure that there is confidentiality protected.
Okay, thanks for that. Any other comments from board members or motions?
I would move adoption of this COA as presented.
And this is Barbara. I'll second it. Thank you.
Great.
I'll take the vote. So Ava Community Energy.
Hold on,
I'm sorry.
Justin. I think we have to go to public comment. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
So let me go to public comment quickly. So any member of the public, if you have comments on 6A, please raise your hand.
The amazing thing is, it is definitely not the first time Justin has been to a
Barbara.
public meeting.
Barb, we can, yeah, so if any member of the public has any comments, please raise your hand. And I'm not hearing any, so yeah, Justin, if you could do the approval.
Thanks. Ava Community Energy,
Abstain.
Central Coast Community Energy,
Abstain.
Clean Power SF,
Yes.
Peninsula Clean Energy,
Yes.
Redwood Coast Energy Authority,
Yes.
San Jose Clean Energy.
Yes.
Silicon Valley Clean Energy,
Yes.
Sonoma Clean Power Authority,
Yes.
Valley Clean Energy,
Same.
Okay, so that item passes. So we are on to item 6B, which is the general manager report. So I'll turn it over to you, Alex.
All right, thanks, Chair Mitchell. Thanks everybody for being with CC Power today. I'm going to run you through a bunch of updates. And I wanted to start sharing slides. And you'll see some technical information and some plans we're going to be launching imminently. I welcome any questions at the right time. And I'm excited to present some of these ideas to you. So first, I wanted to acknowledge Clean Power San Francisco and thank them for helping us schedule our member forum. With Director Hale's help, we've landed on an opportunity to tour the Hetch Hetchy site and also to conduct some board activities. So this forum is now, I'd say, almost officially, finally, October 21st to October 22nd. The plan would be to meet in that area near the west entrance of Yosemite, about 2.5 hours from the Bay Area, on Tuesday, October 21st around noon. And then we'll stay the night at a lodge up there. And then on the next day, we would head out to this Hetch Hetchy tour with some optional activities and a dinner after that. We recognize this is a large time commitment. So the plan would be that if folks need to leave after the Hetch Hetchy tour, they're free to do that. But if some want to stay, it is a neat area and there's an opportunity for a little more time together as a board. So we'll keep that in the agenda. Director Hale, welcome any further input from you, but for now, the plan would just be to hold this time on folks' calendars, and then we will be sending information as appropriate.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you. And just to be clear, the Hetchy tour would include lunch, and then the optional activities would be the afternoon activity and dinner. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so now let me just quickly report out that the board's instructed me to report out where I've used my signing authority. And so there are a couple of items I wanted to note for the board. On the Tumbleweed project, 2 issues have occurred. We've authorized a consent to collateral or executed that. This helps with the project developer's financing. And so that's been conducted and that was reviewed by the project advisory subcommittee. Additionally, they've updated their letters of credit, which are being held in escrow, and that will also has occurred in conjunction with their financing. So that's what's happening on Tumbleweed. And then in terms of other contracts we've signed a consulting engagement agreement with RMS Energy. This is for transmission and distribution consulting services, and we have a couple reasons for this, one of which is going to be discussed later in the board budget matters, but then also we wanted to have this team available for us for doing some diligence on potential projects where we're trying to understand some of the transmission and distribution risks or complications. And so this team can help us with that. Okay, I'll move on. I'm excited then to share about some phase 2s that we're going to launch. There's a bunch of reasons why we want to launch these now. And so the ones that we want to undertake this week or the remainder of this month are the following 3. Negotiating additional long duration storage, launching a geothermal strategic pursuits phase 2, and then conducting further diligence on Cottimo. And I'll speak to the Cottimo one in a moment. So let's dive into each one of these and you'll get a feel for it. And then we'll be following up with you for the various expressions of interest. Okay, so how are we authorizing this? So the board last year authorized certain budgets for CC Power, and within those budgets was this sub-authorization to pursue phase 2s. Here were the total amounts that were authorized in the budget. And some of these funds have already been applied for info projects where we've invoiced you. But this does give us room to check in with members and see if they want to participate in further phase 2s. So we're viewing the cost of these phase 2s as already authorized. And now we really just need the members to opt in, which was always the plan for for the opt-in side of it. Okay, so let me explain what they are. The first one is additional long duration storage. And here we know members are through CC Power and also individually pursuing their own long duration storage or LDS compliance. And one idea was to look at some tech diversity. CC Power might be the right vehicle for that. And Amy, can you go to the next slide, please? And what we want to do now is after our solicitation, we have one project we want to negotiate with. We estimate we'll have 6 participants involved in that. In some ways, the negotiation may not be that expensive, but the total not to exceed we've forecast for this phase 2 exercise would be $150,800. Some of that would be non-discretionary staff costs, and some of that would be these discretionary costs of council and contingency. And once we've negotiated it in conjunction with members, we would come back to the board to seek authorization for a phase 3 to execute an offtake agreement. So this could really just take a couple months, but we're not entirely sure how long the negotiation will take. And as you all know, circumstances and pricing have been changing. So we feel it's appropriate to get into an exclusivity situation and to negotiate now. Okay, I'll move on. The next phase 2 we'll be launching is the geothermal strategic origination phase 2A. And I think it's helpful to share that many members have obligations to look at firm clean resources, and CC Power has been a venue for that. And what we're doing here is looking at trying to help members have additional deal flow for geothermal in ways that they may not otherwise have access to. Specifically, what this strategic origination approach does is it works with earlier stage developments through an RFI, and then it engages with the developer to conduct support for the developer in exchange ultimately for exclusivity and an opportunity for a PPA. We think this is a way to shake the trees and get additional project opportunities for geothermal with an eye towards California geothermal. And so we're confident that this could lead to some good opportunities, although there is a fair amount of uncertainty here. The way we've structured the budget is as a not to exceed of $414,000. Some of that would fall on the non-discretionary side, and then $200,000 on the discretionary side. On the discretionary side, I want to emphasize there's legal counsel, 2 different types of legal counsel. There's some consultants and diligence consultants. We may also be working to understand matters better. So we have travel conferences. And then we may also, in very limited fashion, look to support or advocate for certain geothermal policies. And that's what the lobbyist would be for. In no way would we ever be using these funds to make campaign contributions or anything like that. It would really more be in the form of advocacy and letters of support associated with the California legislative process or budget process. So there are staff costs embedded in this, and the total budget actually would cover about 14 months. We do see this as a longer lift project because of the need to work with the projects as they mature over time. And then ultimately, the members who are participating in this would have access to any projects that originate out of it, and would again face the decision to negotiate and finalize that, which we were calling a 2B. We foresee the 2Bs being, incurring some additional legal costs, but we're not including those additional costs in the $414,000 at this time. So that would really be an opt-in phase 2B decision for each member when the project opportunities arise. Okay, and Chair Mitchell, I'll keep going and then we can pause for questions after that. So the third phase 2 that we're going to start is on CODIMO. So this is a short duration, somewhat aggressive look at the CODIMO project to do some diligence. And so in a way, I'm calling it a 2A light. The plan would be that we launch this 2A so we can conduct some diligence on the project, have a more formal seat at the table with the right members who are willing to support this, and then to work with the developer on understanding their project better, looking at any additional information we may need for CC Power go, no go to pursue a full phase 2. And so the 2A not to exceed is really a 2-month effort And then you'll see later that ongoing further work, if members opt into it, would be part of the next year budget. But this gets us started now, and we feel it's timely given where some of the potential funding asks might be for getting funding support on CODIMO. So that's the nature of this phase 2. And again, this would fit within the already approved budget from the 2024 to 2025 cycle, which we're still in. And then you'll see CODIMO again show up later in the 2025 to 2026 budget discussions, where this phase 2 would end and members would again have to opt into the next cycle of the phase 2. So I know that's a little confusing, and I'm happy to try and answer any questions. But that's where I've landed with these phase 2s. And since everything and the spending was authorized pursuant to the budget, our plan will be to check in with each individual member to see which of these they want to opt in for. And as they opt in, the pricing becomes clear. And in some of these cases, we have expectations of a lot of members. In some cases, it's fewer members with larger or smaller shares. And I think CODIMO is a good example where the members will give an indicative level of interest, and that will be the cost allocation for that member. So it won't be pro rata on some of these. Okay, so with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, or we can jump to the next slide and see a rack up of the potential cost allocations. So based on preliminary expressed interest, this is what we're forecasting for participation for these 3 phase 2s. And sorry, Chair Mitchell, I'm happy to pause at this time.
Yeah, well, I think that's the end of it, right? The 6B.
Yeah, there's one more slide, but this is a good place to pause.
Okay. Chair Cyphers.
Just a question. So you talked about political activity on the GeoZone, and as the sponsor of 3 geothermal bills, I love hearing that in concept. And I think every member of this agency did recently vote to support those bills. But I would like to just get more clarity. So in the past, this entity has really let CalCCA lead the political conversation. And so if we're shifting gears, I think that's a topic worthy of a deeper discussion, and one where I'd like to know where the guardrails are and what your aspirations are. And I'm open to the conversation, but I'm nervous about it. So I do think having the lanes clear is important. So it's really more of a flag. I don't think it's something we have to fully resolve today, but it's a topic I'd like to know more about. Thanks.
Yeah, may I just quickly respond, Vice Chair Cyphers? We agree with you that we want to make sure we stay in our lane and really respect the role of CalCCA and individual members in choosing their, pursuing legislative advocacy here. And you'll see this in the scope of work. We try to really narrowly authorize the work that the members feel is appropriate for achieving the goals of the project while still being subordinate to CalCCA. And we have discussed this with CalCCA, so they're in the loop and understand the intent would be to be very narrow and to work really collaboratively with our members on making sure we approach this in a smart way. And I think you raise a good point that understanding the guardrails is going to be really critical. And that would be something we're going to navigate with the project participants.
So just flagging, like, I don't know that we could be subsidiary to CalCCA as a governmental entity when they're not. But let's talk about that further. So I haven't really thought about this. Thanks.
Okay. I look forward to it.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think we really need a deeper discussion at the board just generally around CC Power lobbying activities. So Alex, if you could think about that for the next board meeting before we go forward with these lobbying contracts, just because I know this is the first time the board's heard about this. And, I think many of us are supportive, so I'm glad you're thinking about this, but I think it will be important to know the details of that and how it, corresponds with what CalCCA is doing, or if it doesn't. And then also just how it also, just make sure that it complies with all of the public agency requirements around lobbying, and so that we're assured that we're not violating any of our own individual policies. is something I would be very interested in. Yeah. Okay, Howard.
Two very different sets of questions. I guess one is just related as a follow-on to this topic is I'm curious to maybe add on to this request of thinking about how we actually engage on potentially lobbying or policy related efforts. Since this is a Brown Act body here, we need to speak to it publicly, but I think there's added sensitivities when you're talking about, you know, lobbying efforts and what exactly are we actually doing if we're trying to support or facilitate a project, and how to actually most effectively do that. And so just want to think about whether there's an ad hoc group that sort of, you know, works with you to think of, you know, how we go and execute that strategy. After, of course, probably a fuller board discussion around what do we actually all agree that we want to generally do in this area. So that's one thing to flag. A totally different unrelated question is just around your comments on sort of what was authorized in terms of budget before. Curious if you can just maybe elaborate a little bit more on the sets of work that you've just identified here related to the geothermal, long duration storage, and Katamo. I would think to be more in the 25 to 26 fiscal year, just by nature of it's April, and so we're approaching the end of the fiscal year. And yet I think in this current fiscal year, we've authorized certain budgets. So I'm curious, how does that come into play? Is something authorized for 24, 25 fully authorized and it just carries over in the next budget year? And how do we, you know, how should I consider that?
This is a great question, Director Chang. So, and Chair Mitchell, feel free to jump in here because I know we've had a lot of discussions about how the board should think about what's already authorized versus what's incremental. So in this case, there's a reason to start these phase twos now. They fit within the currently authorized fiscal cycle from last summer that was approved last June. And so it made sense to have that be the authorization path for these projects, subject to members opting in. We also had a concern that it would be confusing if we asked for additional authorizations when members had already, in fact, authorized this. And so we think it makes sense that we accept that they were already authorized and then the members have to opt in. And thirdly, since we are looking at a whole new budget going forward, starting in July, the way we'll frame up that budget for you momentarily is that a lot of what's already authorized is sort of deemed to be authorized and is not represented in some of the pictures of the budget, so that it's a little easier for board members to understand what's incremental versus what they've already been invoiced for. So we've tried to make that clear so members understand what any incremental authorizations mean versus what they've already authorized. And the classic example there, Howard, is for members who've signed Tumbleweed. They know that that project will be activating and it will have millions of dollars of money moving through the project accounts. And is it helpful to share that in the budget when that's already been approved? And in fact, we do share that in this concept called a general budget summary. But for some members, that's actually already authorized, and it may be more helpful to know just what the incremental spending authorization they would be granting is. So hopefully that helps, and I'm happy to dialogue or defer to Chair Mitchell on that.
Yeah, I think on item 6C, we'll get into that in more detail, but it is a really good question, Howard, and part of the discussion that we also wanted to have there as well.
Can I just tack on one little follow-up there on this topic? So just wanted to flag, I guess I'll note the AVA number of what was authorized was around 270K, and I would just flag as a follow-up to this, maybe useful for me to refresh myself as I had just stepped into this board role. I think when that authorization took place, on what was that, what was the breakdown of that? And I think part of my need for clarification is that was a lump sum that I don't know where that's allocated in terms of different types of projects or workflows. And therefore, I don't know what is actually technically still authorized, because I don't know if a project fell away or Ava decided not to participate in a project. Does that authorized budget fall away, or is it there for some other use? So that's just a clarification I have.
Yeah, those are exactly the questions that the ad hoc committee has been wrestling with. And so we'll talk about that a little bit in more detail. We wanted to get some feedback from the board on item 60. I think we could do it both ways, but wanted to come here to the board to have that discussion. Any other items, Howard, on the GM report you wanted to talk about?
I had some discussion points on Cotomo, but I'm also happy to cede to others if they want to talk about items that I can always raise that later.
Up to you, Howard. You have the floor, so if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, the item I'll raise on Cotomo is just a cautiousness to take on too much development spend there or development diligence. Just because I know that the offshore wind project obviously is a very challenged space in California, and I think in concept I support it. I think there's a lot of value to trying to find new technologies that can move forward, particularly related to offshore wind, but also given the uncertainty and the challenges it faces, just to not expend too much time, effort, or dollars. I think we can engage, support it, but hopefully we can see how it tracks since there's so much risk associated with that. So that's just a general comment I have of cautiousness on how much we engage and how much effort and dollars we expend on that effort.
Yeah, great comments.
Thanks.
Okay, Monica.
I wanted to chime in a little bit on the lobbying discussion as well. I appreciate Director Cypher's comments there. I too have concerns about where we draw the line between CalCCA and CC Power and what the kind of original intent was of CC Power when we formed, and whether this is someplace that we wanted to get to at some point. But one of my broader concerns is CC Power is a procurement entity, and soon will be an operating entity too, right? And so I want to make sure that we position CC Power as a very neutral entity, open to business from anyone. And so aligning ourselves with a particular developer or a particular project or a particular technology for that matter, and putting a lot of our efforts there, whether it's lobbying or just the perception, I would just caution that would not serve us well long term if we want to be that known as a neutral entity in the market. So I'm a little kind of concerned just because at SVCE, we don't do a lot of development. We don't do development work, right? We take a project at a PPA state and we leave all that development risk on the developer. And so, where is the line? Where should we be as CC Power? Should we start to cross that line and facilitate development as well? I'm a little bit worried about that for the reasons that Director Chang raised as well with respect to Cotomo. So those are my concerns. I certainly welcome whether it's just another presentation at the board or an ad hoc committee or whatever it is, but I think it makes sense for us to talk about that.
Yeah, great comments. Okay, Rob.
Thank you, Director Mitchell. A couple of quick things, if I may, Alex. One, I hate seeing attorneys as discretionary and lumped in there with like consultants and travel. Attorneys are important components to making these projects successful. And as part of that, maybe a little bit more seriously, but not too much. I'd like to get a better sense of CC Power's OpEx, because it's a pretty general term baked in around some of the budget assumptions for phase 2. And as we move forward, I'd like to get some better insight to that. I think there's an assumption around some of these projects that now is a good time to move forward before there's more uncertainty. And I'd like to test that assumption a little bit and whether or not that is the right assumption, that now's the right time. And I think part of that might be clearly identifying sort of the goal and outcome associated with the different phase 2 efforts. Because I think what you're hearing, and I agree with Director Chang and Director Padilla's comments around not moving too quickly in support of a particular project or a particular developer, but I see a lot of the benefit, whether it's the GEO or the Cotomo sort of exploration about positioning CC Power to help move California forward with the development of these hard to develop resources. So whether a particular project is successful out of this, and maybe phase 2 shouldn't be tied to Cotomo, but just offshore wind being involved in, what does it take to make us successful so that hard to invest in industry, once it becomes more viable in California, that we're in a position to be able to move forward with projects that are real, tangible, can be brought online at a cost point that makes sense for our customers. So I'd encourage you to think about sharing that. What do we tangibly want to get out of those? And I'll save the questions around sort of the incremental authorization for 6C when we talk about the budget. I guess the only real question in there, Alex, is what is the CC Power OpEx? How do you calculate that?
Happy to share more about the OpEx. So in the authorized budget, that is our phrase for computers, insurance, some of the events we organize, and some miscellaneous expenses. So that'll be a part of the budget item. And I can blow that out for you. I would say a lot of the one confusion about it is that not all the costs apply to phase 2s equally. Some of the costs are insurance requirements. And so those are associated with the PPSAs we have. And so those may flow to projects in particular. So it can be kind of complicated how the costs flow, but we have all that documented pretty explicitly, and I'm happy to share more about it.
Thank you.
Mitch.
Yeah, thanks, Lori. I just wanted to comment real quickly on a point that Rob just made. I think it's sort of a fascinating discussion that we're having right now, because as we look back on sort of the reason why CC Power was formed, there were several different reasons. One of those was, sort of to Monica's point, having a collective procurement kind of strategy. But one of the other sort of, at least as I understand it, one of the other reasons why we formed was to go after these harder to do type projects that are a little bit over the horizon. And so I just wanted to reemphasize what Rob said. I think it would be a really important exercise for us to go through to sort of identify what those goals are under these different, why we're taking these steps, because I think that will help maybe sort of shape our discussions going forward. So just wanted to support Rob's point on the goal setting, or at least recognizing what the goal is for each of these. Thanks.
Okay, any other board comments? Oh, sorry, Philippe, did you have a?
Yeah, Alex, I was curious if you wanted to address that specific item on the objectives of each of the phase 2s, or if you would like me to do so.
No, let's just go to the next slide really quickly. It'll say next step. So you guys have raised a good point about what's the goal of each one of these phase 2s. I think to make this palatable, on the next slide, here's the plan. For each one of these phase 2s, there is a full scope of work. And that scope of work very explicitly says what the goals of it would be, why we think members may be interested, what they would get out of participating there. A good example would be the long duration storage item is very much to negotiate to final PPA terms that helps the members decide on a go, no go. The geothermal origination is a more complicated set of goals we have. And then likewise on CODIMO, and this diligencing effort we think is an appropriate one for the members for a couple reasons, and that'll be laid out in the scope. So if we go to the next slide, you can see that I think that'll be the best way for members to evaluate if it's a fit. But in parallel, I think I've heard some great ideas about the need or relevance or use for a discussion at the board level on revisiting the goals for CC Power and where it's the right tool for the member CCAs, and then also having a clear discussion on guardrails on lobbying and what that would mean and how we're comfortable with that, or what restrictions we would want to put on it. One last thing to note is that similar to the LDS authorization, we do foresee up to 2 additional phase 2s that members would be interested in, starting next month. Specifically, those would be on 2 specific geothermal project candidates where we would ask members to opt in to pay for the negotiation. And then those members would be in a position to sign or at least face a go, no go decision on those projects. So with that, Chair Mitchell, I think it's probably an okay place to wrap up the GM report. And I'm happy to field any further questions as directed.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Any other questions on the GM report? Okay, I get a public comment on 6B. Any member of the public wanting to comment on the GM report? And raise your hand. Okay, I'm not seeing any there, so we are on to 6C, which is discussion of the budget. I think I'm going to lead this. All right, so if you go to the next slide. So first of all, I really want to thank the Budget Ad Hoc Committee. We've had several meetings over the last 4 months. So really appreciate all of the time and effort that Mitch, Monica, and Sean have put into this, along with me and Alex and Philippe. I think it's been a good process, and we have a few things that we want to bring forward to the full board before we bring forward a final recommendation on the budget next May for approval. So we'll go to the next slide. So just a reminder of, you know, how we got here and whatever our next steps are. So this really kicked off in January with Alex and Philippe, you know, visiting each CCA and really understanding what was important to them in terms of what CC Power should focus on. So I think those were great meetings, great to get all the input from the various members. And then the ad hoc committee really started in March and April. So we took that feedback that Alex and Philippe had gotten from the members, discussed you know, various proposals on the budget, and where we are today is here for some discussion on where we've landed before we'll ask for final approval in May. Okay, so next slide. So out of the work that was done over the winter to understand what members are interested in, this slide is a quick summary of that. Just note that things highlighted in blue is what has already been approved by the board. So I'm not going to go through that at all. But for phase 1, you can see there the various items members wanted CC Power to explore. So that transmission, education, joint action strategies, alternative technology exploration, roadmaps for supporting becoming a scheduling coordinator, and then an equipment bulk buy pilot, as well as some deal flow to all of the members. So that's where the mega project and an annual solicitation comes in phase 1. In phase 2, we just talked about a lot of this in the GM report, but there's the additional offshore wind, pumped hydro storage, as well as wind and other pursuits there. And then in phase 3, really just a limited amount of work that hasn't already been approved, which is including the prepay consideration, and then just the project expense around the computer-based trainings. Okay, so next slide. So a lot of discussion happened at the ad hoc committee, and you know, it was indicative of, you know, some of the questions that are brought up by the board today, especially Howard, some of your comments of, you know, how do we focus on what's already approved versus new? And, you know, as a committee, where we focused is really we should be looking at the new incremental items that already was approved by the board. So for example, those phase 3s, hopefully everybody already has their board approval. That's already there. We didn't see a lot of value in revisiting that. I think there was some question on the phase 2, that approach there, because the way it was approved in the budget, it was approved, but it's also subject to members opting in. And so we did have a lot of discussion around that, which I'll get to in a moment. But just wanted to frame that up. Some of the things that the ad hoc committee really took in as feedback is that we wanted to streamline this and make this easier for members. You know, we still want to maintain that opt-in approach, but we also want to align with everybody's budget process and get numbers in the spring so that you have one number to bring to your boards, or in my case, my city council, for approval. And we're not asking members to go back to their boards and governing bodies for approval throughout the year, that there's enough there to continue to do what we want CC Power to do for that fiscal year. So those were some of the things we talked about. Now, of course, you know, that gets a little bit tricky with the phase twos, because at this point in time, we can estimate an amount, but it ultimately depends on who opts in and then what that final participation rate is. So we'll go to the next slide. So what the ad hoc committee is proposing is G&A continues to be the same. You know, it's an annual one-time due payment, but a little bit different this year. You know, G&A is, as Alex described before, and that's within the JPA agreement. But then phase one, what we are recommending is that's also a full amount that would be approved once the board approves the CC Power budget, and that we approve it all in one. So if you could go back to the slide, 2 slides before quickly. Yep, there. So that phase one would be all approved in one line item by the board, and CC Power would immediately invoice for that. But we are recommending that D-Flow origination for all members, that annual solicitation and the mega project, that would be allocated based on the share by each member. So we know, for example, that in a mega project, I'm going to take more of that likely than a smaller CCA such as Valley or Redwood. And so we thought it made sense that, you know, I would pay a larger share of that original, you know, that origination work. So that's something that, you know, when we get to it, let me just get through the rest of the slides. We'd like to get a lot of feedback because that is a change from what we've done in the past, but wanted to talk to the board about that before we have a final recommendation. The advantage of that approach is that you have a lump sum amount and we can get forward, and we avoid, you know, needing to go back to boards throughout the year, which I know is hard for most people. But the disadvantage there is that it does mean that phase one is more for some members. So we'll get to that when we talk about it. Then phase two, this again is a similar approach of something we wrestled with. So, you know, we could continue it the way it's been, as you have an estimate, but then it depends on that project level participation. Or I think we're the ad hoc, and I'll let the ad hoc committee also give their opinions here. You know, another, you know, kind of clean approach would be to just treat it like the phase one, where you have that full amount authorized, you go ahead and get invoiced for it. And then, you know, of course, CC Power needs to true up those account balances and tell members where they are with those. So that's something we wanted to get feedback from the board on. I personally like the idea of just including all of G&A phase 1 and 2 one time. I'll go to my council to get that recommendation. And then, you know, if there's, you know, in phase 2, I think the trick there is that each member needs to really think about what their participation level max would be so that they get the appropriate authority from their governing body. So for example, with offshore wind, if you know you're very interested in that, and other members drop out, how much more would you be willing to take, and make sure that you get your governing board's approval for that, so that there's enough in there to cover that as we get throughout the year. So that's something definitely want to talk about with the board. And then phase 3 really is pretty straightforward. Those are previously approved contracts. I think everyone already has approval for that, but they will start to, as those start to come online, project account balances will be updated quarterly, and then we'll move to monthly for those operating projects as they start to generate. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so here's the incremental costs of the things that we asked CC Power to look at through that. So phase, I'm not going to go through all the amounts here, but we'll send these out to the board so that you can take a look at that. But you can see it's a pretty modest increase for this year, you know, but while still, you know, maintaining those objectives that we set for CC Power to continue to grow the organization, continue to look at emerging technologies and the other items that were directed by the board. So next slide, this is the one that everybody is going to be most interested in. Okay, so how does that land for your individual CCA? And you can see here the phase 1, 2, and 3 costs. We will also send this out to members so that you can start to think about this and use this to start to draft your own governing body recommendations on where you might land. Of course, this is based on input that CC Power has gotten from your staff or yourselves on the project participation levels. And if that's not correct, I think this is a great time to make sure that's clarified. And we'll talk about those levels in a second, but I would really encourage board members to make sure that they're clear with Alex on where they are with the phase 2s, especially. You'll note that some of these phase 2 costs are higher, and that's because of the CADMO potential for helping them with the interconnection, which, I definitely hear from members, and I have my own thoughts on that as well. So whether that's in or out, that has a very material change to phase 2. It's about $2 million. So without that support of CADMO, phase 2 is significantly less for all of the members, that we wanted to provide a maximum number here. Okay, and then let's go to the next slide, which I think will also be really helpful for the members. So this is CC Power's best estimate of the participation levels for each phase. Again, we'll send this out so that members have this, and encourage everybody to check in with Alex to make sure this is correct and what your current thinking is. And then finally, you can, one thing I just want to point out, you can see that phase 1 where everything but the mega project and the annual solicitation is the same, and that's how we've done it in the past. But you will note the change that the ad hoc committee is considering is that for the mega project and the annual solicitation, that those participation levels are aligned with the amount of megawatts that those members would take. Okay, and then I'm going to get to my last slide and we'll have a great discussion here. Okay, so where we are today, feedback from the board on discussing, this new approach for phase 1 and 2, as well as the participation levels. The ad hoc committee will meet one final time in early May after we get input here at the board to come up with a final proposal for the board. And then we expect to bring that forward May 21st for that CC Power board meeting. And then invoicing, important to note what we've done in the past, and I would recommend continuing, but open to board discussion here, is that board approval would be subject to your own CCA board, and in my case, my city council's approval. And then CC Power would start invoicing in July or August of 2025. And with that, I am going to recognize Sean Marshall, who is on the ad hoc committee, which I really appreciate, and let us hear from her and her thoughts on this.
Thank you, Lori. I actually have a quick question. I thought, though I will just briefly comment on the process with appreciation to GM Morris and Philippe and staff for a very logical process, even though this budget is, honestly kind of convoluted and complicated. Have to kind of do it that way. And I appreciate all of the iterations and truly fine tuning that went on over the last month. I have just a quick question about, since you brought it up, when the CADMO interconnect deposit issue will be brought to the board, if at all, Director Morris or GM Morris, or if that's something you're going to be dealing with individually, because as Lori noted, it has significant impact on the budget. And I know there's probably some mixed feelings about that.
So I recognize that's a really important issue. The way we're approaching that is that the project participants would need to wrestle with it. And so the first step was to activate the phase 2A, which we're going to authorize right away. That gets the right members in the room to understand the facts, and they can decide how they feel about it. Since we're probably going to pass the budget before that subcommittee has decided what they think, we're including those funds here in the proposed budget, with the recognition again that members would need to opt in. So we're not trying to get ahead of anyone, but it seemed most appropriate that only the participating members would decide on that, and that's how we structured it sequentially.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I thought it was important to have maximum numbers there. And then you can do the math. If you don't plan to participate, you could take that out, right? But I thought it's just, you know, when I go to my council, I want to go once. And so I want to get authority for
For the
what
whole-
I might need. And
Yeah.
then if I pull it back, fine.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, Monica. And thank you, Monica, for being on the ad hoc committee. You contributed greatly, and it's been a pleasure to have you on there.
Thank you. I also want to express appreciation for GM Morris, Philippe, and also for Lori for kind of reining us and keeping us on track with this ad hoc committee. It's been a very big learning experience for me, quite frankly. And so, and I know I have a lot of comments and sometimes they make sense and sometimes they don't, but I think they're incorporated for the most part in what's been proposed here. A couple of things. One is on the phase 2 projects. And I think what became very obvious to me as we were going through this process is that CC Power needs some flexibility because the phase 2 projects are very fluid, right? And they change, and either sometimes they're there and then they go away, and the participation levels can vary. So how do we make it so that we can put in place a process that allows us to take advantage of opportunities when they come up, but also be true to what members want to participate in and their city councils or boards have approved as well. So I think the proposal kind of reflects that, but I'm sure there could be a little bit of tweaking as well. With respect to the CATMO, so SVCE has indicated that they're not interested in participating, and, you know, certainly support anybody else who's interested in participating in CATMO. My concern on the deposit, which I understand is refundable, but I'm not 100% clear on that. But my concern with the deposit, even though we're not participating, would be that we put in place some real clear, like, what's ring around just the participants, that if for some reason that refund doesn't happen, or the participants are on the hook for that, whatever, $2.5 million, that they cannot come after CC Power or any of the non-participants. And we're very clear with that when we developed the PPSA, right? That only the participants bear the benefits and the obligations and the risk. This is something new, that a deposit. So whatever you do, I just want to make sure that CC Power is not on the hook for anything, and nor are any of the other participants for that matter. Non-participants, I should say.
Yeah, those are really good comments. I agree with you. Yeah.
Thank you again.
Yeah. Mitch, our treasurer, we could not do anything without you.
Well, a lot gets done without me, thankfully. But what I would just sort of point out too is that, I mean, this is sort of three-dimensional budgeting, you know, in a lot of ways, because, you know, having to sort of figure out what we all kind of need as individuals, and then taking that and translating it into multiple projects with different sort of component pieces. I think it's really, it's a delicate dance. And I think that Alex and Philippe and Lori and others on the subcommittee really, I think, have helped advance this and mature the budget process, which I think is an important kind of point. I would, you know, on the specific comment about CATMO, I mean, we're interested in continuing to participate in that, but I think Monica's point is spot on. Being able to isolate that deposit and understand what that actually looks like, what it does for us, I think is going to be an important component. So, but mostly I just want to say thanks to Lori for leadership and the work of staff on the budget. It's, I think, been a good process to get us to this point.
Thank you, Mitch, and thank you for serving on the committee. I know it's a big time commitment. Jeff.
I just wanted to offer kudos. I think this is thoughtful, and in the spirit of we're still doing a lot of things for the first time. I think it's good enough. So I'm looking forward to seeing the final things.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Howard.
I have maybe two different sets of comments. One is just related to the sort of the budgeting process and the year-to-year shifting, and then set of comments related to kind of the phase 1 load allocation methodology. On the kind of year-to-year budgeting, I may be in a place where I just don't recall the details of what we authorized for this fiscal year. So shame on me if that's the case, and I apologize, but I would definitely benefit from that refresh. And I guess one thing I would throw out there, either for consideration or perhaps for comment if it was considered already, is do you wipe the budget clean each year? Because there are a lot of uncertainties during the course of the year of, oh, does this entity actually opt into the phase 2 or does it not? And if you don't, does it make sense to carry that authorization forward to the following year? Because if those funds have been invoiced, what are those funds actually allocated to? So is there a need to actually wipe the slate kind of each year and say, well, this is what we did, and this is who opted in. So based off of that, we are now saying, you know, these 6 entities opted in, so we're going to carry forward their authorized budgets into the next year. And we're good on that authorization, but these entities perhaps did not, and we made some decisions not to even, you know, move forward and engage on some of these projects. So some of these funds are not necessary. And technically, there's not any clear direction on where to put these funds at this stage. So we should, you know, we should net that into any future budget authorization. Say now we only actually have to invoice a lesser amount because those funds are remaining. So,
Yeah, I'm so glad you're asking this question because it's something the ad hoc committee wrestled a lot with. And even on our discussion on Monday, had it. So I'd be very interested to hear board members' perspective on this. And this is exactly what we want to get so that we can finalize the budget. My personal opinion is I would prefer phase 2s to be invoiced, and then, you know, we opt into what we opt into, and then carry it over and, you know, invoice me less the following year. That would be easier for my process, but I'm very sensitive to people have different processes. And so that this is exactly the kind of feedback we'd like to hear from members so that we can finalize that proposal. The alternative is we could, as you say, and you know, I don't think it's a big deal either way. We could go either way. I just want to make sure that we come up with something that works for the majority of the members. The alternative would be for phase 2 is we invoice it, and then people opt in or don't, and we send that money back to them at the end of the year, and we start afresh the next fiscal year. So I definitely like to hear from members what's easier for them, and I'm happy to go with what works for the majority. I don't know if Howard, that answers your question, or if you have thoughts on that.
it does answer it, and I'll just say my feedback is I'm indifferent on those two. I also probably prefer the efficiency of just net it into the next year's invoicing. No need to send it back and then pay it back forward. I think the important point that I want to emphasize is it's really useful to sort of have a reconciliation of the accounting and the actions taken. So if these parties move forward on opting in, and this is what we actually think we're spending, then we'll kind of true that up. And by the end of the year, say, actually, you know, you authorize 250K, you only move forward on 100K. So there's 150K left over that's not technically authorized for anything. And we'll net that in the next year's balance. So we invoice you less then. That accounting would be useful to know, like, oh, these are the actions we took, and that's what is left over. So that's probably the most meaningful part of that comment I would make.
Yeah, that's something we're definitely working on with Mayor and the accounting, and something that Alex has really been focusing on with Mitch. I don't know, Alex, if you want to talk about that, because we're doing that anyway for the phase 2s monthly. But if you had thoughts on that for I'm sorry, for the phase 3s, but if you had thoughts on how we would do that.
Thanks, Chair Mitchell. Yeah, so Howard, the language we're using is a project account balance statement. So, you know, any phase 2 or phase 3 account will track at the project level per member. So we really will be very meticulous in understanding how much of your funds sit in that account or that project. And then we'll give you these invoicing these statements that say how the money was used, how much you have left. And in the case of the phase 3s, there may be a moment where you're supposed to maintain a certain cash amount in there, and we would either refund you excess or invoice you to top off that account on an ongoing basis. The vision is to get to that monthly, but for the upcoming year, we expect the phase 3s will be monthly, and any phase 2 balancing accounts are quarterly, because there's obviously a lot less happening in the phase 2 accounts. And then over time, as the accounting engine gets tuned up, everything would be monthly, and hopefully people get pretty comfortable with these monthly account statements coming through.
Yeah, and let me just say, I'm not concerned with the kind of operational mechanics. I appreciate those insights, of course. I think my comments are more just about knowing what is authorized and what kind of remains versus what's unspent, so that we can account for that. But I appreciate those finer details.
Yeah, and then one other thing that the budget committee that I just wanted to clarify for members, you know, was considering is, you know, when we do prepare the final budget for the board approval to, you know, have it as one line item to give CC Power that flexibility that Monica was talking about, where still members have to opt into phase 2 projects, but there is a, you know, we all know that things change throughout the year and there might be a project that comes up. And so at least there is an ability for members to participate that without going back to their budget and get additional approval. So definitely wanted to get feedback from the board on that too, or whether you'd rather it go line item by line item. And the downside of that, I think, is what we found is that then if things come up and change throughout the year, there's just less flexibility and members have to go back to their boards and, you know, kind of reauthorize something, which I know is something we're all trying to avoid. So with that, I know, Rob, you've been patiently waiting, so I will recognize you.
Sorry, everyone. I appreciate all of the work that went into this, and this is a really great discussion as well. So I love the ad hoc approach, and I think getting like Director Padilla and Director Marshall, their input into the process is really helpful, and gives us sort of points that we can learn more about the budget. Around this issue, I think I would certainly prefer the flexibility of having it approved and there and accounted for, and not have to go back and reauthorize. So not having it re-released back to 3CE. I think that seems more efficient and effective for me and 3CE. And I do like the approach, the transparency that doing account statements and true ups would be helpful. You know, I'd love to learn a little bit more about just how those dollars would be, you know, are they separated? Do they sit in one account? Would it be interest bearing? You know, I'd like to get a good sense of that. I think it probably should be interest bearing. It doesn't have to be separated accounts, but you know, that's a more technical accounting question that I think would be good, maybe for Director Sears, our fearless treasurer, who's so well in tune with this to work on. Thank you for all the work.
Lori.
Yeah, thank you to the ad hoc committee for thinking this through. I just want to say that I think that we would also prefer flexibility and not have funds refunded, that they would just roll over, and we would see a reconciliation and some sort of statements about how they're being used. But yeah, it's easier for us to not have to go back and get additional approvals. So we'd rather just approve it and allow CC Power some flexibility during the year.
Sounds great. That is my training as well. Approve the budget once. Okay, Barbara.
Thank you. And thank you to the ad hoc committee and to the staff. I just want to join the voices. I think I've heard a consistent message that we want to give CC Power flexibility. We want to not have funds refunded to us. So I'm agreeing with that. And I'm hearing the director say we're going to have a tracking accounting method that balances out that flexibility with the assurance of us knowing where the money went. So I think that's good. And I just want to amplify that. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Barb. Rob.
Apologies. Just I do not have a June or July meeting to approve, so we would do it in August. Alex, if that becomes an issue, just let me know and I can try to work something else out. Just wanted to share that.
Yeah, that's helpful. I know everybody's got different schedules over the summer, so. Alex, do you foresee any issues with that?
I do not. So that's really more of a cash flow issue. We'll be fine. Thank you, Director Shaw.
Great. Monica.
Yes, so I think I will be approving the budget again, just like condition on my board approving it, but we'd approve the whole, that's how I think the process that we're going to use. Also want to just reiterate that we're supportive of everything that's been said already, that we allow for flexibility on phase 2 projects, and rather than refund, carry that money over, and all the accounting and transparency, 100% support. I also just wanted to reiterate, I think Chair Mitchell talked about it briefly about phase 3 projects. And so when I looked at the original budget and I'm like, oh my God, this is a humongous budget. I'm gonna have to go to my board and explain it. Then then my staff said, no. Phase 3, we've already approved our board has already approved that when we signed the PPSA, right? So all the phase 3 monies that have to go out for the cost and what we expect to get back in the market, that is kind of really just a pass-through thing for CC Power. That is not part of their budget. So when that got removed, then everything else kind of just fell into place and it seemed really obvious to me. So I appreciate where we've moved on that as well and be very clear about that so that when each of the members see their budget, they understand that most likely they already have approval for phase 3 projects and that it doesn't have to be sought. So again, thank you so much. I look forward to having, I guess, a final proposed budget next month, hopefully.
Yeah, I think one last ad hoc committee, Monica. And then we'll come to the board for a final approval. All right, Howard.
I just wanted to emphasize a point on as it relates to Cotomo and the kind of phase 2, I think, B interconnection related expenses, since that's one of the lumpier ones. I sort of echo the thoughts that phase 3s are committed. They're known. I think it makes sense to authorize that, move forward. Phase 2 is in this interesting bucket where we're not sure if we're going to move forward. We're not sure if what entities will opt in. And so I just want to emphasize that I think the concerns around the idea of, funding even a reimbursable interconnection expense is a very different type of expense than I would envision CC Power taking on. And I think we're going to have some follow-up discussion on whether that makes sense or not. And just merely flag that's a larger expense. So, while I agree with the idea of pre-funding CC Power, because you got to give the entity cash flow to go, make decisions, be flexible. I just wanted to take the opportunity to emphasize that I don't necessarily think that we should fund that interconnection, and therefore that would have a significant impact on whether we opted into that project or not. So just want to flag that for consideration as when you develop a budget, given that there may be some big chunks of money that are highly uncertain. How do you manage that? And if it's just we're going to invoice more, that's okay. I'm comfortable with that as long as that's what we think is the best decision. So I wanted to emphasize that point. And then separate topic, I did want to talk a little about the concept of the phase 1 load allocation. And I'll just say I appreciate the intention here, at least what I understand to be the intention. I had a little bit of time to catch up with Alex on this approach, and I think the intent is to try to account for smaller entities carrying a larger burden financially for some of these processes. And is that fair? And so it's an intention to try to be more fair. I shared some concerns with Alex, and I'll reiterate them here, which is just I'm very supportive of trying to be fair. I have some concerns around splitting out phase 1 separately and taking a load weighted sort of cost allocation, because one, it is differentiating from the general dues. And I had thought of phase 1 as really dues. And so we actually, as a CCA, have certain authorizations go pay dues without additional board approval. And so that makes me just think about, do I need to actually separately seek approval for phase 1s versus dues? And I don't know if there's any implication on the JP or anything like that. If there is, I certainly would caution us to require any amendments to the JPA. The other thing is just, I guess, on the topic of fairness, I do have some concerns there. I think the larger cost on a dollar level is not a concern. I think whatever that larger percentage share to Ava would be, I think is a reasonable dollar level. I am concerned on the fairness aspect, just in so far as we don't actually participate in a lot of the annual solicitations. We participate, but I don't expect to actually take projects, I guess, is really more the point. For the geothermal, for the long duration storage, we were fully procured on those projects. And so I just want to highlight, yes, we're a larger entity. So in some sense, we would get a larger share of a project. But in the annual solicitations that we've done historically, we knew going into it that we were not going to accept projects from them for the most part. So I want to highlight, I don't know that would be fair. You might create a situation where entities before an annual solicitation goes out may say, I actually don't want to participate in the annual solicitation, because if I have to pay actually 20% of that solicitation cost, and I don't actually expect to take any projects, it would just make more sense to say, count us out. But I don't want to feel inclined to do that, because I do think there's a benefit in everyone participating and both supporting CC Power, but also supporting the process. So that is a concern that I sort of have on shifting that process.
Yeah, no, thanks, Howard, for your thoughts on that. It's definitely something that the ad hoc committee struggled with is, as we looked at phase one, some of the higher cost items were, for those annual solicitation and the mega project. And, we did see that the dollar amounts for the smaller members was increasing. And, we had some discussion, well, does that make sense given that, some of us that are larger may take a larger share of that? But I totally take your point. If you're not going to take any of it and then you're still invoiced for it, that's not fair either. So open to suggestions on that. I'm not sure there's a perfect answer to it, but certainly if board members have recommendations for the committee, please let us know so that we can finalize. But yeah, I definitely take your point there. Barbara.
Thank you. I just want to say to Howard's points, I have some of the same reservations about the change using the phase 1A approach that's been described. If it's implemented, we would probably need to see for our approval process a cost share agreement approach to it. I don't think that would require that might obviate any need for a JPA amendment. That sounds like a onerous step. And then the other thought is it might help folks like me to better understand how you got to the phase 1A, load share approach, to see what you saw, Director Mitchell, as a subcommittee on what the other options were that were looked at. I might get more comfortable with it just seeing what you saw, kind of getting a chance to walk in your shoes there. Thank you.
Yeah, no, happy to follow up. So the other option is to just, maybe we could pull up the slide of the project participation share. But so the other option is just to do what we did in the past, and everybody gets the same amount, and it's just like the dues. So that's certainly something, I'm open to board member feedback if people would prefer just to leave it the old way. Happy for that. I think what we saw is that increasing amounts for the smaller members. So sorry, if we could go back to the project participant, I think it's just the next slide. Yeah. So you see there under phase one, everything is about, just over 11% for everything. So that would be the alternative instead of for the mega project and the annual solicitation, just go back to that approach. But what that does is, I think you can see it pretty fast without, probably showing you the numbers, is, the smaller members, phase one is more expensive for them. So I don't know, Mitch, if you want to chime in as our treasurer and also as a smaller member on the other side of that argument.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. Sorry, Rob, I know you have your hand up. Okay. Yeah, I mean, we did sort of kick this around a little bit. I mean, it's not dissimilar to some of the discussions we've had with CalCCA over the years, but these two, I think in particular, were identified in ways, these sort of really were more oriented towards how much an offtake might possibly be going forward. That I think is the base rationale. Now, whether that convinces anybody or not, but and it's hard from a smaller member standpoint, the dollar numbers again are not sort of, I think if it switched back to the previous approach, which just peanut buttered everything across, for VCE, that we would probably continue to participate. I don't want to negotiate against myself here, but this seemed to be a little bit more in line with sort of the eventual potential outcome of a mega project or solicitation, where we would, in almost every case, I can't think of a situation where a smaller member would take sort of an equal share of a particular project. Now, not to say that couldn't ever happen, but whereas the other components here that are sort of split evenly, there's that sort of equal value across those particular endeavors. So that's, I guess, where I would put it from a smaller member perspective. But and again, from a treasurer's perspective, certainly we could do it any number of different ways. Continue on with the existing, or look for this other. We would need to obviously understand what the implications are to the JPA, and see what kind of, if it necessitated any kind of amendments, and what the board's appetite for that would be.
Yeah, and I think we did look at whether or not it needed amendments, and my recollection, Alex, is that it wouldn't with this approach. That was something we were sensitive to, because we know that could be challenging for members too. It's something that we are trying to avoid, is amendments to the JPA. Alex, did you want to talk to that? Really
That's
quick?
correct. Only the G&A is required by the JPA agreement to be shared evenly. So the phase one dollars, in theory, we could be flexible about it. And I could remind people, we also have this default allocation that is a blend of equal allocation and then load weighted allocation. So it would land a little more in the middle. And that's something that the ad hoc committee may wish to consider.
Yeah, and then just finally, if you could go to slide 21 really quick, just to answer Barbara's question in real time here. So you can see what those phase one costs are by member, and you can get a sense for if we peanut buttered it versus how that might move up and down. But you can see some of the smaller members, it's starting to get pretty large, compared to what they're probably expected going to take. So that's something we were just considering, but open to the board's feedback. As a kind of not super large but fairly large member, I can see it both ways.
Thank you for circling back on that point and going through the numbers here. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay, Rob.
Thank you, Director Mitchell. This is important conversation, and I think it is a little bit broader because I think about the long-term success of CC Power and, creating an environment where we are sharing risk and appropriately sharing that, and making it so that smaller CCAs can participate around these projects, I think is an important part of CC Power's long-term success. I hear the concern, and just looking at this slide, it looks like 3CE is carrying a fifth of the total cost around the total projects here, and that's there's a little bit of looking at that, but we are the board, so I think there might be an opportunity as we move forward to maybe separate some of the decisions about participating in phase one of projects from the actual budget decision, so that we're not making direction, policy decisions and project decisions as a budget decision, but separating the two. Because I think we're hearing a lot of discussion about what are the benefits of the phase 2B interconnection question. That's a significant cost. And I'm not hearing a lot of support around moving forward with a project or with an investment like that. Similar to the mega project, I think from a structural point, the approach the ad hoc committee is taking makes sense. But if you could get direction earlier from the board and from the members of, is this something we want to take up, that might help drive where CC Power spends its time and where their phase one dollars in investment are. So that would help address, I think, some of the concerns that we've heard that we may not participate in a mega project. And I think 3CE isn't likely to be an off-taker from a mega project either. And that separating those two decisions can help solidify some of the questions as we move forward with different budget iterations.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is helpful. I mean, I think, where the ad hoc committee, our understanding is that feedback had happened in the January, February timeframe with the staff as Alex and Philippe visited staff and, heard from the various members of what their priorities were. Obviously things change as things get more more defined. So, don't want to hold anybody to that, but definitely take your point there, Rob. Hey, Sean.
I just love to chime in really quickly that I'm reminded that when we were going through this in one of our earlier meetings, we were talking about the phase one costs and, you know, wanting to make sure that there was enough of a kind of an a la carte menu for people to participate or not with no pressure. But that it was important to have enough in phase one costs so that people didn't bail out too early. They stayed on the bus, they investigated, you know, projects, and then, you know, got the information that was relevant and stayed involved during kind of ideation before, you know, making a final decision. So that, as I recall, that was also part of the earlier discussion for phase one.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right, Sean. Thanks for bringing that up. That definitely was discussed a lot by the ad hoc committee is, you know, really trying to, as you know, the board has expressed, is wanting CC Power to look at some of these emerging technologies and, you know, kind of give them enough room to, you know, get these projects a little bit further along before, you know, people have to decide thumbs up or thumbs down, you know. Yeah, thanks for that. Howard.
Just one final comment from me. My earlier statements were mostly focused on phase one costs, but I realize obviously phase 2 and 3 are significantly more dollars overall, or phase 2 at least. On the phase one costs, I just wanted to note that obviously whether it's $150,000 for Ava or it drops down to closer to 100,000, that's not a material amount that I find to be so critical. I really want to just focus on the efficiency and the participation and how we think about that. And I definitely support the broader group if we feel a change in this allocation is fair and makes sense. I'm generally supportive of that. I wanted to make that comment. The other comment I want to make, though, is just around, it seems to me phase one costs, I guess there's a lot of things there that are, some of them are not load weighted and some of them are load weighted. So for those things that are load weighted, just to think about whether it's assumed that everyone is participating or if there's clearly an opt-in or not, and what comes out of that is one comment. And then the other comment I want to make is just my assumption is that, you know, the costs associated with, you know, running 2 solicitations, annual solicitation and a mega project solicitation, are fairly cost effective. You know, they're efficiently managed here by CC Power. And obviously when you're splitting across 9 members, it's already a significant savings for any individual member as is. So while I'm absolutely sensitive to, you know, smaller CCA, you know, such as VCE, want to be respectful there. Hopefully there's already cost savings inherently in how we're dividing it by 9 as is. And so thinking about additional load weighting while may further balance that, I'm not sure if that's fully necessary. So just wanted to highlight that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe we can go to slide 22 just so people can see how. Oh, I'm sorry, Lori. Yeah, you have the floor.
Yeah, I was going to just chime in as small CCA as well. That I'm supportive of however the overall board wants to do this. I think that we recognize that there's just simply, you know, there's an additional cost to doing business due to economies of scale. And so we're not, you know, we want things to be fair for everyone as well. And as costs go up, I agree with Director Shaw, though, that it would be good to sort of help separate and align like what our goals are, maybe a little bit more, but I think that, you know, the staff did a great job in coming up here and visiting, and we did the best we could this year. And yeah, so I'm generally supportive of whatever the overall board wants to do.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. All right, we are almost at 3. So any final comments on this? I really appreciate everybody's feedback. I think we've gotten a lot here and I think we're almost there. But any final thoughts on the budget before I go to any public comment? All right, I'm not hearing any, so I'll go over to public comment for item 6C. Any member of the public wanting to weigh in? Okay, I'm not hearing any. So we are on to item 7, discussion of any individual member items. Anybody have any good announcements? I know yesterday was Earth Day. Hopefully everybody had some good celebrations. Rob.
the reminder. Look forward to seeing you all next week at Cal CCA, their conference in Irvine.
Yes, very exciting. It's already next week. Okay, any other items? Mitch, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to recognize them, not condemn, but commend Vice Chair Cyphers for sticking around for an hour plus budget discussion while not feeling 100%. So thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff. Always a trooper. Okay, with that, we will let Jeff go back to getting better. And just really thank all the members for the good discussion there. I think we're almost there. And with that, I'm going to move to item 8, which is to adjourn the meeting.
Thank you.
Thanks,
everyone.
Thank you, Laura.